Good morning, class 8, and welcome to your history class. So dear students, if you remember, then we were doing lesson number 3 from history, and the name of the lesson is Ruling the Countryside. So when we began with the chapter, we came to know that the Diwani of Bengal was given to the British East India Company by the Mughal period. And after that, the British officials tried their best to collect as much revenue as possible from Bengal, isn't it? And in their quest of collecting more and more revenue in their journey, they began to devise new techniques of collecting land revenue. And so they started coming up and devising new techniques, and they came up with the idea of permanent settlement. So according to the permanent settlement, the revenue was to be collected by the zamindars from each village, and ultimately the zamindars had to give a fixed revenue to the British officials. So for some time the permanent settlement system was working well, but since the revenue which was fixed was so high that the zamindars could not pay back the British officials what they promised, because of which the zamindars started exploiting the peasants, and they started taking more and more money from them, so that the British can be satisfied with the revenue that was being given to them by the zamindars. But then of course the system was very suppressive, very depressive. The peasants could not give enough money to the zamindars, because of which most of the zamindars stopped doing their duty, and thus this permanent settlement idea was a flop. Okay, then the British thought of devising another kind of settlement so that revenue can be collected properly. And this system, which was devised in 1882 by a person known as Holt Mackenzie in Bengal and in the northern part of India, it was called as the Mahalwari system. So according to this system, Mackenzie devised a plan through which the various plots of land in a village was weighed, it was measured, it was studied properly, and accordingly some amount of rent was fixed for the particular land. So for example, in a village, if there were 10 plots of land, then after examining all the plots, some amount or some rent was fixed, and this rent was to be paid by the farmers themselves or by the owners of the land themselves, not to the zamindars but to the village headmen. The system of zamindars were now banished according to the Mahalwari system, and that is why now whatever money was collected from the owners of the land through the rent, that was given to the headman, and the headman was responsible for paying the money totally together to the British company. Okay, so remember one thing, in permanent settlement the amount of revenue was fixed, but in case of the Mahalwari system, the amount of revenue was not fixed. It kept on changing as time demanded. So along with this system, another system in the south was being devised by, first of all, a person known as Alexander Reed, and later on it was further taken forward, or it was further developed by the British official whose name was Thomas Munro. So this system was called as the Rayatwari system, and later on this system also came to be known as the Munro system. So according to this system, it developed mostly in the southern part of India, and here the villages in South India were measured, they were studied properly, and then the farmers, who were also called as the ryots, they had to pay the rent or the money directly to the British East India Company. There was no middleman, there was no zamindar, it was the peasant who was responsible for giving money for their own land. So this was the Rayatwari system, or also called as the Munro system. So this two system of Rayatwari and Mahalwari became very famous, and at the very beginning they were working really well because it was devised so well. But slowly it started suppressing and oppressing the peasants, because since the rent was not minimum, and since the rent was not fixed, that is why the British East India Company kept on increasing the rent as their demands also kept on increasing. Therefore, although this system seemed to be great systems, it seemed to be successful, but still later on it was understood that even these systems were not perfect. So this is what we have discussed in the last two classes, if you remember. I just tried to say everything very quickly and very short and very brief so that you all can understand and recall, since there were 2 days holiday and like you must have been forgetting as well, isn't it? So anyway, I just tried to recall everything, recapitulate everything, and I hope that after reading the textbook, I'm sure you all are already clear about it. So today students will be talking about a kind of crop. A kind of crop that became very famous in Europe, that was in high demand in the European markets. And the English wanted to use that plant and grow that plant in India as well. So which plant am I talking about? Which crop am I talking about? So we will come to know about that once we go to the textbook and try to understand from there. So the topic that we are going to start today is crops for Europe. So the British, as they started establishing their power, and they started to reform certain measures while collecting revenue, they understood one thing very well. They understood that the rural area or the countryside or the village, it was important not only as a means to get revenue or money, but also the land of India was so fertile that they thought of growing certain crops here which were not traditionally grown. Okay, so the British understood two things. The countryside was a great source of collecting revenue, and number two, certain crops can be grown in India which are very much in demand in Europe. That is why by the end of the 18th century, the company tried its best to expand cultivation, to do cultivation of certain crops which were not originally or traditionally grown in India. So accordingly, they started cultivating opium and indigo. Opium is basically derived from poppy seeds. It's a kind of alcoholic drink that can be obtained from the poppy seeds, which is known as opium, and also indigo. So what is indigo? That I will tell you as we move on with the explanation. Okay, so the company started expanding the cultivation by doing the cultivation of opium and indigo. And slowly in various parts of India, they began to cultivate certain crops. For example, in Bengal, jute was cultivated, tea was cultivated in Assam, sugarcane in United Province, which was known as United Province at that time, and at present it is known as Uttar Pradesh, wheat in Punjab, cotton in Maharashtra and Punjab, and rice in Madras. So these are certain crops which the Britishers started to pay attention in, because all these crops, they were very much in demand in Europe. Okay, so now the British used a variety of methods to ensure that the cultivation of these crops are done. So in order to explain you, or in order to show you how the British expanded the cultivation of various crops that they needed, that were in demand in their market, a story is given here. A story about a particular kind of a plant which grew very well in India, and at the same time it was very necessary. It was in high demand in the markets in Europe. So students, look at figure number 5 and figure number 6 as given in your textbook. So if you see figure 5, you will see it is a kind of print which is known as kalamkari. Okay, so it was done mainly in the southern regions in India, especially Andhra Pradesh, with a pen like tool. That tool was known as kalam, and this printing, making of this design was known as kalamkari. Okay, it was very famous in India, especially in the south. If you see figure number 6, you will see a very beautiful floral cotton print design, isn't it? So this design was made by a person, a very famous poet and artist of the 19th century in Britain, whose name was William Morris. So now if you take a close look at both these pictures, look at figure 5, look at figure 6. Both of these were made in two different countries by two different kind of communities. But still there is something common in it. Can you recognize what was common? Well, the common about both the print which was made in South India and the one made in Britain was that both used a very rich blue color. I'll take you back to the pictures if you can see. So both these in both these prints, blue color was used very well. Majority of the print had blue color. So this blue color came from a plant which was known as indigo. So today in our class, basically we will be discussing about how indigo was produced, why was it so popular, and how the British was dependent on India for this blue colored thing, a blue colored dye that was produced from a plant called indigo. So basically from the plant called indigo, a blue color dye was used. Okay, dye means a color, somehow powdered form, the color was extracted in powdered form, and later on in the factories it was it was liquefied and then used in coloring the clothes. Okay, so the painting that we saw in the picture above, especially the paper, the painting made by Morris, not the paint but the print made by Morris in Britain, this painting or the color used for this print was used from indigo plant, which is cultivated in India. So indigo at one point of time became the biggest supplier of indigo in the world. So in the world, wherever you see blue dye, you will understand that it was made through indigo, which was taken away from India. Okay, so let us see about the demand of indigo in in the European market. So European plant was grown in the tropics, and India is such a country which is somewhere located in the tropical region. That is why India's climate and land is very suitable for the growth of indigo plant. So in the 13th century, that means long time back, Indian indigo was used by cloth manufacturers. Those factories where clothes were produced, especially in Italy, France and Britain, in order to dye cloth. That means to give a rich blue color to the cloth. However, you need to remember that only a small amount of indigo reached Europe, because its price was very high. Since indigo was not grown in many parts of the world, and since most of the indigo went from India, that is why its price was very high, and at the same time the demand in the European market was very high. So in Europe, the cloth manufacturers had to be dependent on another plant which gave a same kind of a color, and that plant is known as wood. Okay, so wood was also a plant. I will share the pictures of both indigo and wood as soon as I finish making this video. So wood was also such a plant through which violet and blue color could be obtained. And what was such a plant which was grown in the temperate zones. Temperate zones means that region where most of the European countries are situated. Okay, so in Europe, instead of indigo, since it did not grow in the temperate zone and it grew only in the tropical zone, therefore they started to cultivate another plant just like indigo, which was known as wood. And with the help of wood, they used to make violet and blue dye. Okay, so because of the availability of wood very easily in Europe, it was greatly grown in many countries. For example, it was grown in certain parts of Italy, France, Germany and Britain as well. So, worried by the competition from indigo, wood producers in Europe, they pressurized their governments to ban the import of indigo. That means indigo's color, the color or the dye that the various merchants or the manufacturers got was very good. The product was good, the color was very bright, and therefore indigo was much more in demand, even though there was a lot of wood production. That is why the various European merchants, the various European producers, they started to demand to their government to stop the bringing or to stop the import of indigo from India, so that their economy can flourish with the help of wood. Okay, so slowly the governments of these countries in Europe, they stopped or they banned the bringing of indigo to Europe from India. But still, if you see the difference between wood and the difference between wood and indigo, then it will be very clear that many dyers still preferred indigo. So indigo's advantage was that it produced a very rich blue color, and wood also gave a blue color, but it was very pale and dull if compared to wood, as I already told you before. Okay, so therefore, since wood could not satisfy the demand of certain manufacturers, therefore in Europe, cloth producers or garment producers, they requested the governments to again open up the market for importing indigo from India. That means they wanted to bring indigo from India once again. Okay, so since that relaxation was not given very much importance by the government, that is why the various countries which were colonizing, the various smaller countries, they started cultivating indigo in their own places. For example, the French, they were at one point of time dominating the Caribbean islands. Then the Portuguese were dominating Brazil. The English were dominating Jamaica. The Spanish were dominating Venezuela. So in all these poor countries that were being colonized by these European traders, they started cultivating indigo in all these places. So indigo plantation was now not only done in India, but it also came up in many parts of North America, as the countries are written here. The Caribbean islands, which are also called as West Indies now, Brazil, Jamaica, Venezuela, etc. All of these countries now had the facility of growing indigo because it was in great demand. But there was one tragedy. The tragedy was that, number one, in the 18th century, the demand for Indian indigo grew further. There was no country in the world that can give the same quality of color that India gave. Secondly, Britain began to industrialize. That means they started setting up of industries and factories. And the production of cotton in those factories, they started becoming more and more. And since there was more production, therefore there was more demand for cloth dyes or cloth colors. Okay, so on one hand, indigo's demand in Europe was increasing, and the supplies that England got from West Indies and America, it stopped totally due to variety of reasons. It can be because indigo was not suited there. It may be because of certain kind of infectious disease that the plant got in those places. The reasons are not cited here. But still, you should know that the dyes from indigo that were gained by Europe through West Indies and America, it collapsed. Okay, and in 1783 to 1789, the production of indigo in the world fell by half. And India was now the only country where indigo was still produced. Okay, therefore, cloth dyers in Britain now started looking for new sources of indigo supply. And what better than England than India? So now Britain turns back to India for getting indigo. Did you see? So at the very beginning, when the government started to ban the indigo cultivation, not cultivation, but the ban of importing indigo from India, then the various colonized countries, the colonizers started to do indigo cultivation. The British and the other European people were happy with it to some extent, but then it collapsed. The cultivation of indigo collapsed. Only it was left in India. That is why now the only place through which the British can fulfill their demand for indigo was India. So their factories which were producing cotton clothes which needed dyes or colors, those now can be fulfilled only when they start bringing indigo from India once again. So now, faced with so much demand for indigo in Europe, all the countries fighting for getting indigo from India, the company took full advantage of, colonizing it. Therefore, the company now took measures to cultivate indigo in Bengal extensively. And this happened somewhere in the last decades of the 18th century. So Bengal indigo was of great quality, and therefore it came to dominate the world market. People all over the world started demanding and purchasing indigo from Bengal. In 1788, only 30% of indigo of Bengal went to the other countries. But by 1810, the import of indigo in Bengal went high up to 95%. So only in a span or in a difference of few years, we could see that the demand of indigo grown in Bengal became very, very high. So growing of indigo or cultivation of indigo in Bengal gave great status to the people now. So there were many officials who understood that they can earn much more as indigo producers in India, because everywhere people in all the countries were now mad over buying indigo from India, particularly from Bengal. Therefore, the company officials many a times left their jobs from the company and they started privately purchasing land or renting land from the landlords and from the local farmers, and they started investing in cultivation of indigo. So indigo business at that time was very much attractive because there was great opportunity for getting high profits. Okay, therefore it was not only the company officials but also many common Scottishmen means the people from Scotland, and also many Englishmen. They came to India, settled here, and they became planters. Planters of which plant? Mainly indigo. And there were many who did not have much money to produce indigo, but still they started taking loans from the company, particularly those middle class Indians who wanted to do big in business. So they thought of establishing their own plantation, they thought of cultivating indigo, but since they did not have much money on their own, that is why they started borrowing money from the company in the form of loans. And also there were many banks setting up at that time, and the banks also provided these people certain amount as loans for cultivation of indigo and for setting up their own business or plantations. So now let us move on to another dimension. How was indigo cultivated? So mainly indigo was cultivated by two methods. One was the niche method and the other was the Rayoti. So we will discuss about both of these systems in details, but as of today I will just tell you what niche cultivation means. Then the other things like the problems with niche cultivation, then how Rayoti cultivation started, all these we will study day after tomorrow, that is Wednesday. So today you just need to know what is niche cultivation. So niche, in the system of niche cultivation, the planters produced indigo in land that he directly controlled. So niche cultivation means growing up of indigo crops, growing up of indigo plants in a land which a person directly controlled. So that land was totally under the control of the producer of indigo, and that land was brought either as a rent from other zamindars. That means suppose I wanted to establish a plantation of my own for indigo, and I did not buy a land, I don't have enough money to buy. So what I will do, I will approach a zamindar, I will take his land and I will give him rent every month. Okay, so directly I am having a control over the zamindar's land by just giving him a particular amount of money. And it was a great idea because whatever amount was to be given to the zamindars, much more profit was actually got by those who were the planters of indigo at that time. Understood? And also in India, labor was very cheap. That is why these planters, they started employing people as laborers directly by hiring them and by paying them through cash or kind. So this is niche cultivation. But of course, niche cultivation also had its own problem. So we will be studying about the problem of niche cultivation in the next class, as I already told you. And also we will discuss about the Rayoti system of cultivation. So as of today,
Please go through whatever has been explained so far. I'll be giving you a few questions as homework. Do those. Read the textbook very thoroughly because all these things are coming for your PT1 exam. So that's all, dear students, for today. Thank you so much.